Freedom of speech. It's in the First Amendment of the Constitution, and it's pretty much the single thing many Americans are more proud of when it comes to their country than just about anything else. Of course, America hasn't always been very good when it comes to protecting free speech. There was a Red Scare in 1919 that resulted in the deportations of hundreds of suspected socialists, and an even bigger Red Scare in the 1950s that harmed or ruined the careers of tens of thousands. Today, the only real reason we have free speech in this country at all is that America can rely much less on what Louis Althusser calls the repressive state apparatus, i.e. the use of violent force and repression to keep people in line, and instead relies on the ideological state apparatus, which encompasses media, outlets, schools, clubs, and so on. These institutions, while ostensibly apolitical, aim to inculcate ways of seeing and evaluating events and class relations that are generally in line with that of the state. Instead of expressing and imposing order through violent repression, the ISA can disseminate ideologies that reinforce the control of a dominant class. Rather than needing to restrict press or massacre protesters, people by and large are co-opted by fear of social rejection into not expressing views outside of the Overton window. With this, on top of the amount of wealth we extract from the developing world, the populace is kept pacified enough that it doesn't have much of a class consciousness and therefore is not a threat to the political establishment. People are often fond of bringing up 1984 to refer to the United States, the Brave New World, in which the populace is kept pacified not through violence but through entertainment and social coercion, is a much more apt comparison. Therefore, leftist political creators today are allowed to exist given their lack of threat, and America can point to itself proudly as a bastion of freedom of speech. But not so fast. As socialist politics become increasingly popular in America, with the explosive growth of new channels and podcasts and journalists with truly left-leaning perspectives seemingly every month, so arises the question, could there be another Red Scare? Let's find out. Just before we get into the video though, I'm doing basically a full 40 hours of work per week on these videos, and YouTube is not exactly going to promote them, so please support the channel in any way you can if you want me to keep making content in the future, and thanks a lot for your support. Some, like the New York Times, have already argued that there might be a new Red Scare already, one against China, specifically. This can be clearly seen already in how obsessed people are with the demonization of China, which I've already discussed in another video, is the US destined for collapse. However, I would argue that the Red Scare goes well beyond just fears of China. In fact, I'd argue that the Red Scare has really never actually left in the first place. Not completely, anyway. Yes, people are no longer arrested or interrogated just for being suspected of having communist sympathies, but there is still a widespread and deeply ingrained mistrust of socialism that permeates every orifice of American society. Many Republicans refer to basically all Democrats as communists these days, as if it's some horrific word. And the Democrats would almost never associate themselves with words like communism or socialism for fear of the connotations that might have. Rather, the playbook for most Democratic politicians is to so vehemently deny that they would ever have any association with something so apparently horrible as socialism. At this point, calling your opponents some flavor of leftist in order to demonize them has become so common and so effective that there's even a term for it: red baiting. And it's hard not to understand why people might be so susceptible to red baiting with just how much dishonest propaganda is spread about socialists constantly. Repeatedly and exhaustedly disproven lies about socialism and fascism being the same thing, or how socialism killed 100 million people, are constantly, endlessly parroted no matter how many times they've been debunked. Socialists are left always on the defensive, considered responsible for having the perfect answer to every crime, imagined or real, that any and every socialist state has ever committed. In the meantime, third parties that represent a more left-wing alternative to the party system, like the Green Party, are actively excluded from elections. Even just a social democrat like Bernie Sanders was conspired against by the media, not to mention the Democratic establishment, just to help make sure he wouldn't become president. And what was done to Bernie is dwarfed by what happened to the Labour leader Jeremy Corbyn, as Al Jazeera's videos on the topic reveal. The academic sphere is basically the only place where socialist ideas are even allowed to be discussed. But while there are Marxist intellectuals out there, people such as Anwar Shaikh, Paul Cockshott, Michael Hudson, and David Harvey, their work is never really amplified or put into the mainstream. And other than for maybe Michael Parenti, Richard Wolff, and Angela Davis, there aren't any remotely significant Western intellectuals I know of in the entire United States that actually do critically support socialist states. It's not necessarily for a lack of academics, journalists, and researchers who do support these states, but mainly the fact that there simply isn't the same level of popular demand for more nuanced analyses of these countries. In the meantime, academics that relentlessly demonize places like the USSR or socialism at large with incorrect information, like those by Robert Conquest, Anne Applebaum, Richard Pipes, Robert Service, Timothy Snyder, or good old Alexander Solzhenitsyn, have made lucrative careers satisfying the public's hunger for distorted and ridiculous caricatures of the USSR, while at the same time, the work has been fairly broadly condemned and in many ways debunked by modern research and most modern scholars. In high school history textbooks, meanwhile, figures with far-left legacies like MLK, Nelson Mandela, and Helen Keller are de-radicalized and sanitized, and the influence and the legacy of labor movements and the Black Panthers in America are quickly passed over at best. And as if it wasn't enough to be hated and feared by most non-socialists, socialists persecute one another as well. Speaking positively in any way about the USSR, or just about any socialist experiment is, even in many supposedly left circles, seen as heresy. You might be laughed out of a room. You'll be seen with mistrust and insulted. People will talk about you behind your back about how you've been propagandized. Even many people who call themselves leftists seem to always think that anyone who defends these states in any way are also completely uncritical of them.
Marxist-Leninism doesn't mean anything. It doesn't. It gets pulled into whatever state-defending, authoritarian, justifying bullshit it needs to represent the interests of state leaders. It doesn't mean anything, so it can mean anything.
If these same so-called leftists actually listened to most MLs and didn't just regurgitate the propaganda they hear, they would see that as a whole, no one is more self-critical than MLs are. The biggest current Marxist-Leninist podcast, The Deprogram, has not one but 2 episodes where they specifically discuss some of the failures of past socialist states in pretty brutal honesty. Of course, being a remotely public figure in even somewhat left-leaning spaces always almost guarantees a large amount of vitriol. But if you go left enough, it can get much worse than just vitriol. A member of the aforementioned podcast, and the creator of the YouTube channel Second Thought, maybe the single most watched socialist content creator on YouTube, was, as he claims in the episode of the podcast, once visited by 2 agents of the Department of Homeland Security after made a video entitled "The CIA is a Terrorist Organization." The reasoning of the agents that arrived at his door? Anti-American sentiment. That kind of phrasing makes me think that maybe the 1984 analogies are a little bit more apt than I give them credit. Anyways, when Second Thought later used an FOIA request, or a Freedom of Information Act request, it turned out that there were about 760 pages worth of documents relating to him. All that was actually eventually given to him, however, was about 6 or so pages, and most of even that was redacted. Ultimately, while America likes to consider itself a bastion of freedom to express yourself, it's never really fully left the Red Scare behind it. The Red Scare has just become institutionalized, normalized to the point that we no longer really see a distrust of socialism as part of some Red Scare, but just the simple reality of day-to-day life. Of course, if the left continues to gain influence in America, if it becomes even a remote threat to the current status quo, well, I guess we'll just have to see how much America's notions of freedom of speech really hold up. And that is it for this video. I hope it was educational. I hope you learned something. If you enjoyed the video, please leave a like and a subscribe and a comment and a fike and a rebribe and a moment. Get it? It's funny because I changed the letters and the words and I made new words. If you want to see me arguing with people or getting overly angry, or occasionally maybe saying something of value, you can also follow me on Twitter at Chemreac1. That is CHEMREAC1. The link is also in the description, by the way. follow me. Or not. Your choice. Bye.